Good afternoon, comrades. Welcome to our latest session in the series, The Battle for Democracy. Tonight we're discussing the issue of challenging state republicanism in the 1860s and 70s. The speakers today is Steve Freeman from the Republican Labour Working Group. Usual format as always, he's going to start the introductions and then we're going to open up for questions and comments from the floor. So without further ado, welcome, Steve.
Thank you, Tina. I'm probably going to talk for about half an hour. Let's begin then. First of all, on the morning of the 6th of May, 1867, a leading conservative newspaper called The Standard wrote, "Today, more than on any occasion since the pitiable episode of 1848, the working men, only men were mentioned there, of London are on trial. They're invited to band themselves together and in a kind of public show of defiance to the constitutional authorities, to violate the law and the plainly defined rights of the Crown, to insult the House of Commons, to annoy and outrage the upper and middle classes, and to jeopardize the peace of the metropolis. If necessary," the Standard thundered, "the military will have to teach the Reform League that sedition is a dangerous game to play in England." The government were preparing for the day. There was a regiment of hussars had come up from Hounslow and was a station near Hyde Park. There was a strong contingent of lifeguards at Knightsbridge and another undercover at the end of Park Lane. Another contingent of horse guards were ready for action. Behind the police barracks in the park, there was a regiment of guards. Inside, the police were ready, unseen, of course, but ready to move in action. In total, there were 10,000 police and military ready for action within half an hour of the government's command. At 5 p.m, the Home Secretary, Spencer Walpole, issued notices against all the leaders of the Reform League at their London headquarters. The government warned the League you could not go into Hyde Park. The government gave them all to understand that they had an enormous array of military force, infantry, cavalry, artillery, and yes, artillery at the railway stations, cutlasses without end at Scotland Yard, batons fabricated at Woolwich, and special constables, ridiculous and absurd as they were, sworn in all directions. So we can see where we are. At 6 o'clock, same day, 6 o'clock, 6th of May, 1867, the Clerkenwell branch of the Reform League appeared at the gates of Hyde Park, carrying a red flag, surmounted with the cap of liberty. And you remember the cap of liberty. This is a symbol from the French Revolution. It's a symbol of freedom and liberty, and it's associated with republicanism. And it's especially during the American and French Republican revolutions, although you can trace it back to even as far back as Rome. So here we had the symbols of socialism and republicanism carried in by this one branch. Half an hour later, there were between 100,000 and 150,000 people in the park. The leaders of the League entered to the sound of great cheering and addressed the crowd from 10 platforms. One platform called for a national convention to prepare for the Reform Bill. If their demand were rejected, 300,000 men should be brought to London from the north, and no man should return until the Commons passed the bill, or until England had found its new Cromwell to turn out the men who had misrepresented the people in St. Stephen's, but St. Stephen's being the place where the House of Commons was until it was burnt down in 1834, and previously that's the reference point. The police were hissed and a few stones were thrown, and yet there was very little crime in the park. That was quite amazing. Maybe a couple of pickpockets, but that's about your lot, given the size of the crowd. So what happened then? What's the meaning of all this? Well, next day, this is, don't forget, this is the 6th of May, 1867, was a great victory for the working class. The next day, the working class press was ecstatic. The triumph of working men was complete and bloodless. It was a great victory, and despite the threats of violence from the Tory government, the working class demonstrators won a massive victory. They called the government's bluff, and by their orderly discipline and peaceable, dignified conduct, they took the moral high ground. The Reform League had shown that Her Majesty's government could not preserve order without the help of the people. In the House of Lords, Earl Cowper declared, "The executive has brought itself into contempt. No greater blow has been struck," he declared, "against all respect for law and authority." The Prime Minister admitted that the government was humiliated, although he said using the kind of language, had suffered some slight humiliation in the public mind. He accepted the resignation of the Home Secretary. The leader of the opposition, I suppose the latter-day Keir Starmer, I don't know, Lord Russell, said the government had failed and had exposed the authority of the law and the dignity of the crown to a degree of contempt that I ever remember before. Asked what he would do, he said, well, he's a great liberal leader, so he obviously declared he would act as in 1848. And we'll come back to 1848 in a minute. The Times considered the defeat suffered by the government was so bad that the leader of the Reform League, Beales, might be considered the actual government of the country. Now, this event, called later the Great Surrender called the Tory Great Surrender, really, May the 6th, 1867, had real constitutional significance. The position and prestige of the Reform League, this working class organization, was now massive, and they won the right to meet in Hyde Park, one of the royal parks, and they made the question of electoral reform a matter of either reform or revolution. It's important to make the point that the idea of constitutional change is something that when you think about constitutional change, you think it's something they're doing in Parliament. It's something like the elites do and behind closed doors. But here we're reminded that questions of constitutional reform are about political power. And the working class was mobilizing to change the constitution, and the ruling class felt very threatened by this. Why, the question is, did the government back down, having assembled such police and military forces to suppress the working class, and then make no attempt to arrest the leaders or disperse the crowd? And the simple answer to that was that the government had the necessary legal powers, but politically they felt it was very risky. So they used the assembly of forces that I talked about at the beginning to try to bluff the leaders of the working class into backing down. But the League and the working class simply called their bluff. The Tories gambled and lost. And as we mentioned before, the Home Secretary was sacrificed to save the government. Frederick Harrison, one of the contemporaries, saw it as the Great Surrender and connected the issue to the right. Connected the issue of the right to enter the park with the question of electoral reform. The Tories, of course, were happy to suppress something they would see as a riot, but they thought shedding blood against a popular cause could lead to revolution. So the Tories did not believe they had enough soft power. They didn't have enough moral authority to be able to do this. And go in, of course, they were scared to go in. Harrison says, the governing classes had kept democracy at bay behind some imposing ramparts. But one day, the Reform League discovered that they were mounted on canvas and logs, not so strong as they appeared. Lord Cranborne in the House of Lords commented, the British Constitution has nothing to fear from revolution unless the owners of property are beguiled into helping to undermine the institutions which protect them. And I think Boris Johnson ought to take a little bit of notice of what Cranborne said. The British Constitution has nothing to fear from revolution unless it is undermined by somebody like Boris Johnson helping to wreck the institutions that protect the ruling class. So this is 6th of May 1867. The Second Reform Act was taken forward by Disraeli in conditions when the Tories had lost control of events. The 1867 Act went far beyond the reform that was about to be conceded a year earlier in 1866. The Reform League and 6th of May had transformed the situation. The Tories were running to catch up and try to get ahead of events. The League itself hedged its demand for mannered suffrage to those who were registered and residential. The royal assent was given to the bill on the 15th of August, 1867. All male households could now vote. Now, up until this point, I've always understood, until I really looked into this, that basically the Tories gave a section of the working class the right to vote, you know, because they were, I don't know what they were, but anyway, I don't even like to say what they were, but anyway. But when you see this story, you realize that they were forced by a mass organization of the working class. We've heard of the Chartist movement, but this Reform League was a very powerful organization. So I think at this point, Tina, I'm going to now try to see if I can see what I can do in just introducing my little PowerPoint, if it comes up. Hold on a second. Okay, get that up there. Call it up there a second. I'm hoping if I do a screen share, something will happen. And there it is. I will share the screen. And I will do something else as well. I think I will probably do that. Okay. So I've called this my talk today, The Death of Republicanism, 1867 to, I can't see that bit, it's probably 1874. And so I've just begun by telling you about the events of 6th of May, 1867. So I now thought what I would do is to go back to take a slightly bigger picture, but look at the path that got us from Chartism to this Reform League. And then when we've got to that point in 1867, 1868, I'm going to look at English republicanism in that period from 1869 to 1874. And in particular, I'm going to talk about the Land and Labour League from 1869 to 71. And then I'm going to come with a conclusion, which I've decided to call the dialectics of republicanism, that will bring us right back up to the present. Okay, comrades, so at that point, I think I'm going to, if that's okay with comrades, and I'm going to go back. So the next point I'm going to make is from Chartism to the Reform League, and I will stop us there with that. I'll go back to, here we go, there. Okay. I think the 6th of May, 1867 is really a turning point in the growth of working class republicanism. So we might ask ourselves what was going on before that date. Let's go out a bit. And I think the first reference point is to go to the defeat of Chartism in 1848. Chartism is as good a place to begin the search for Republican socialism as anywhere else. As we know, the first mass political movement in England, the 6 demands of the People's Charter were moderate demands, really. They wanted votes for every man over 21 years of age, secret ballots, no property qualifications for members of parliament, payment of MPs, equal constituencies, and annual parliaments. And despite these being quite limited demands, the Chartists gathered around themselves a very militant movement ready to fight for their democratic rights. And it's one that terrified the ruling class, who were ready to use force to suppress it, because they were very worried that democratic reform, albeit limited, would enable the working class to start taking control of the political process. And so the date I want to reference, because it was referenced before, of course, is April the 10th, 1848. So while revolutions were bubbling up across Europe, the Chartists organised a massive demonstration in Kennington Common, intending to cross the Thames to Parliament with a giant petition. Queen Victoria, fearing the imminent arrival of the Republic, fled to the Isle of Wight for safety there. Meanwhile, the government brought up the same kind of armed forces that I was just talking about in 1867 to occupy the London bridges and prevent the Chartists taking their petition to Parliament. And the Chartists, rather than try to take the bridges, backed down and were defeated. And they were defeated by the Duke of Wellington. So the whole thing about Wellington and Waterloo. But anyway, the Chartists, when they faced the threat of military action and bloodshed, decided that they didn't want to go for that confrontation. Chartism never recovered from the setback, and not least because the European revolution was soon overcome by military sort of counter-revolution across Europe. And so I think you have to see the defeat that took place in London is similar to those defeats that were being suffered in the working class across Europe, not least the June days in 1848 in Paris. Chartism died not simply because of conditions in London, but because of the European democratic movement being crushed. And although Chartism continued into the 1850s, it was without its previous momentum. And so it took 20 years for the working class in England to recover and take the initiative again in parliamentary reform. The leadership of the Reform League, because there was another one called the Reform Union. The Reform Union was a middle class organisation. The Reform League was a predominantly working class organisation. So when we get back to May the 6th, 1867, you can see the government is trying to repeat the events of April the 10th, 1848, when they had forced the Chartists back. But this time the government suffered a humiliating defeat against the mass ranks of the working class. And it's probably worth at this stage comparing briefly Chartism, French Republicanism, and the English Reform League. Chartism had 6 demands, I mentioned before, but they did not include a republic, and they did not include women's suffrage. The French working class did demand a republic and did demand women's suffrage. The Reform League of 1860 or 1867, they were talking about it, was not a Republican movement and had an even more moderate, or if you like, reduced program than Chartism. It now came down to only 2 things they wanted: universal male suffrage and the vote by secret ballot. The more moderate demands of this Reform League did not prevent it getting into confrontation with Her Majesty's government. I think there's one other factor I'm always going to pass over, but it's important in the Republican story, of course, is that between 1861 and 1865, the American Civil War took place, and that did revive republicanism, and it did revive support for the Northern forces, the Northern Republican forces, and Abraham Lincoln and so on in the working class areas. And I think we probably talked about that before, so I'll pass over it, but it added a fuel to a kind of militancy, the need to fight, to a different kind of atmosphere, if you like, which comes back to 1866. We've arrived at 1866 when the Reform Bill is being debated in Parliament. This is 1 year before the events I first described. In July 1866, the year before, there was a large demonstration in Trafalgar Square. The League resolved to meet in Hyde Park. The Met Police Chief, Sir Richard Mayne, was given the job of preventing entry into the park. And we can see that's going to play out again. The leaders of the League demanded entry into the park, but were denied admission and went off to Trafalgar Square. But this angered the crowd. There was a crowd there and they were pretty angry about this, even made worse by the fact that the police let upper class people into the park, didn't let the working class people go into the park. So that made them even more angry. So what the crowd did was they burst down the old railings. And then there was like 3 days of occasional intermittent skirmishing with the police in and around Hyde Park. The Tory Home Secretary, Spencer Walpole, the guy who's about to get sacked in a year's time, he met a deputation from the League who offered to restore order on condition there was a halt to action by the police and military, and the Home Secretary gratefully accepted that. So there was a kind of pre-confrontation taking place a year before. But it did look as if the League was now getting into a position in terms of maintaining law and order in the park. And as you can imagine, the Tory press and the establishment were outraged and humiliated because, and they were fearful of something else that was going on, and that was an alliance of the Irish and the League and trade unionists that was developing. After this fighting with the police in the park in July 1866, the movement for parliamentary reform started getting ready for bigger battles, with political forces mobilizing, thinking they would have to have a grand street fight, and some were working for an alliance with the Irish Republicans or Fenians. They wanted a Fenian Reform League alliance. And the Reform League began to organize on physical force lines and establish what they called a reform constabulary, because the Met obviously wouldn't do that. And they also organized their petitions. And this movement, as it was growing up, had two, well, they had two demands, two direct action demands, which came to the pass. And these were, one, they wanted a people's parliament chosen by non-electors, and they wanted a grand national holiday. So think about that. The People's Parliament was the idea that it would be a rival parliament to the Westminster Parliament. And the grand national holiday, I think, was another name for a general strike. They were going to take a day off work. They would do those two things together. And so on the 1st of May, when they're getting close to the 6th of May, when it all kicked off, 1st of May, 3 senior police officers attended a delegate meeting of the Council of the League and informed them of the government's decision to bar entry into the park and bar them from taking part in any meeting. A majority of the delegates resolved they would not yield. The contest was now, would there be a real reform bill or not? The resolution was that the meeting would be held and the crime of interfering with it would be on those who tried to stop it. So the government, having backed down during the skirmishing of July 1866, began to prepare for the battle in the way that I said, and so on and so forth. At the end of this meeting, Charles Bradlaugh, who becomes one of the leaders of the new Republican movement, said to the meeting, "We gather on green sward," which is green grass, I guess, green sward. "We shall have to gather there as a people's parliament, denying you, the commons, as it were, are the parliament of the nation. And we will gather there with or without your permission, for it is our right." So there was a militant mood in that time. And for me, it links to something we're calling for in Republican Labour, but we'll leave that for another moment. So I'm coming to my point number 3, keeping an eye on the time as well, Kina. I'm coming now to talk about English republicanism. It's kind of growing out of this militant struggle against the government for parliamentary reform. So I really want to talk about the English Republican movement, if you like, from 1870 to 1874. Now, English republicanism in the 19th century owed a lot to events abroad, and particularly the American and French revolutions, and I mentioned before the American Civil War. And I've already mentioned once before, if you went on demonstrations, you would see stars and stripes, you would see the French tricolour on working class demonstrations. There was in England an anti-monarchist trend that focused on the royal family, and I made that distinction before. The royal family was seen as lazy, expensive and debauched. And of course, Queen Victoria disappeared. She wasn't really doing any public stuff either. She was just somewhere else anyway, in widow's black robes or something of that type. Anyway, in addition, it turned out that the expected gains from the 1867 Reform Act didn't really make a lot of difference. And so the working class still felt excluded from politics. So in the late 1860s, there was growing support for republicanism, there was in fact a very lively tradition of working class republicanism, including many Republican clubs, especially in London. And indeed, there was a sort of popular cult of the protector, Oliver Cromwell, often projected, however bizarrely, as a kind of working class hero who cut down aristocratic privilege along with the Stuart monarchy. So in the 1860s, there were two actual competing conceptions of republicanism in this left movement. The first saw its idea as completing the bourgeois revolution, as it were, by removing the aristocracy and reforming land ownership. The republic for them was about meritocracy and equal opportunity, and it was focused on land reform, the aristocracy, the sufferings of agricultural workers. And in particular, it was associated with the Land Tenure Reform Association and John Stuart Mill. The second trend was linked, of republicanism was linked with the working class. Against the idea of a democratic republic, this tendency called for, now here I'm going to try my French and it's not going to work, so I'm going to, hopefully Marie's out there will come to my rescue at some point, but anyway, called for la République démocratique and sociale. That's the best I can do. We will recognize, the Republican Labour Congress will recognize this as the Democratic and Social Republic that stood for social welfare. There were different tendencies in this trend, but some thought a political revolution would lead to a social revolution. And this was linked also for them with the issue of wage labour. This tendency insisted not in land reform, but the nationalisation of the land. This is how you pick the two sides out. When you hear nationalisation of land, think republicanism. It was the aim was for a republic that was democratic and social, and this meant a republic that would take social measures to emancipate the working class. And this tendency, by the way, owed much to Karl Marx and the Land and Labour League. So I'm now going to go to the Land and Labour League. The Land and Labour League was an organisation set up at a working class conference at the Bell Inn at the Old Bailey in October 1869. Marx told Engels that the Land and Labour League were directly inspired by the First International. It showed that, that the Workers' Party dissociates itself completely from the bourgeoisie. There were a number of trends in this league, by the way. So it was a more unified, it wasn't a totally clear move, but you had Chartists, you had Owenites, you had currency reformers. But Harrison, in his review of this, says that Marx was justified in believing that his tendency within this was the dominant one. You can sort of see that, you can see the program somewhere else. But anyway, in September 1870, a new journal called Republican was set up, and it became the unofficial voice of the Land and Labour League. It reflected a growing sympathy with republicanism and in the working class, and it would soon be greatly boosted by the events in Paris. League members on the unemployed demonstration held on Good Friday 1870 wore broad scarlet sashes like the sans-culottes had worn during the first French Revolution. The League reached its influence by the spring of 1871, and at that point, the Republican moved from a monthly to a weekly publication. And of course, the big factor in all this is the fact is that, in parallel to this, on the 4th of September 1870, the regime of Louis Napoleon collapsed. As Marx says in his pamphlet, the working men of Paris proclaimed the Republic. Men seem to do a lot of stuff. I don't know what else was happening, but anyway. Marx fully supported this in his address to the council. And although Marx had never had any illusions, this was greeted by working class people in this country as an event of great significance and something which they very much supported. The Paris Commune Republic, as it were, excited widespread enthusiasm and encouraged Republican sympathies in Britain. Charles Bradlaugh, and I mentioned his speech before, was nominated, like Paine had been, by the city of Paris as a candidate in the French Assembly elections of February 1871. So those links were being made. So Marx and Engels were enthusiastic supporters, seeing in this the discovery of in the Paris Commune as the discovery of the working class form of the Republic. Yet the Land and Labour League was, from its peak, went into decline. Although it continued till the end of the 1870s, it more or less seems to sort of kind of fizzled out. And there are two factors in the decline of the Land and Labour League. The first one was the defeat of the Paris Commune in 1871, which divided the movement and fragmented it. Because a defeat is always a setback. And then, of course, the people on the defeated side start blaming each other as what went wrong, who got it wrong, and all those other things. So it leads to a kind of fragmentation of the movement. And the second thing that happened was a reinvention of the monarchy by Disraeli. He persuaded Queen Victoria to come out of hiding and had a big ceremony to make her the Empress of India. And so you can see this as a rise of late Victorian imperialism, late Victorian empire that would have sort of take away some of the imperative towards republicanism. So when republicanism was now defeated at this time in the 1870s, where did it go? Well, I'll just end on this point and then come to my conclusion. The republicanism went into the Democratic Federation in the 1880s. So it was still in the program of the Democratic Federation. And then you may remember that the Democratic Federation gave way to the Social Democratic Federation. And as it gave way from the Democratic Federation to the Social Democratic Federation, republicanism started to slip right out of the picture altogether and went onto the back burner until it was more or less irrelevant at that point. So I will make a conclusion, try to sum this up now a little bit. My conclusion is this, and I want to just talk about, I'll call it the dialectics of republicanism. After 1874, Republican politics died in the English working class, but not in the Irish movement. And Kevin is going to be looking at the Fenians, I think, next week. But the death of English republicanism was a bit like an exploding star as the debris scattered before it, and was eventually replaced by Labourism and the rise of the Labour Party. In this sense, republicanism was negated by Labourism, because obviously as the working class got the vote, the possibility of a Labour kind of party rather than the need for a constitutional change became the thing that dominated the movement. So I would see that the Republican epoch in our history began, I would say, in 1648, and the arriving, or maybe 1647, I want to be exact about it, with the arriving English Republic of 1649, continuing as a strand right the way through the Glorious Revolution, right the way through the 18th century revolutions in North America, France, Haiti. Republicanism was the ideology of the radical working class and involved Tom Paine. We looked at some of these. Edward Rushton, the Liverpool's blind Republican poet. Shelley, the radical Republican poet, who wrote, of course, the Mask of Anarchy to commemorate the 1819 Peterloo Massacre, and on to Chartism in the 1840s, where George Julian Harney had his paper called The Red Republican, Helen Macfarlane we talked about last time, and William Cuffey, the Black Republican leader of the London Chartists. That is the whole period of our republicanism. So my thesis is dialectical. It says in the period from 1648 or whatever date we'd pick to 1874, we had republicanism as the dominant trend. It was a republicanism largely without socialism. Republicanism was soon going to be replaced by socialism, but it would be a socialism without republicanism. So if we think of this process, the thesis, the historical thesis is republicanism. It meets its antithesis in socialism. But this then forms a synthesis historically, which we could call a republican socialism. We are living, I would argue, in that period right now. And it's a period that began when Tony Benn introduced his Republican bill into the House of Commons. Republican socialism is therefore a synthesis of Republican and socialist ideas, and we need both to be able to make sense of the present. And I'll end up with Jeremy Corbyn, why not? The Corbyn movement, which was the biggest working class movement born out of the opposition to Tory austerity and the 2007-8 banking crisis. It had hundreds of thousands of supporters in the Labour Party and the trade union movement, and millions of voters. In Corbyn was the first post-war Labour leader who was declared a Republican, and he was a follower of Tony Benn. Although his republicanism was kind of long-term and not immediate and not something to get in the way of, what he wanted to do, which was to become a Majesty's Labour government and introduce a programme of rebuilding and restoring the 1945 social monarchy, welfare state, mixed economy, and all those other things. So Corbyn was a Republican, but didn't really take it that seriously. I would end up by saying, however, we're in a different epoch now. Republican socialism is coming, and it should come out of a critique of the Bennite and Corbyn movements. Democracy in the UK is dying under our feet, and like it or like it not, the Republic is coming. I'll finish there.
Thank you, Steve. I've got a couple of comments myself quickly, or questions more like.
Okay.
On your last point, firstly, saying that republicanism was negated by the Labour Party rather than picked up by the Labour Party. And I want to question that a little bit without being an expert on it. But I do have a picture on the wall of the 1910 electoral program of the Labour Party, where it shows the working class ramming down the House of Lords and doing away, and it says, abolish the House of Lords was an electoral demand of the Labour Party in 1910. So I think they did probably take some of these issues at various times seriously. I mean, Keir Hardie was a very strong Republican and was very strongly in favour of abolishing the monarchy, for example, as were others at the time. Not the mainstream Labour Party, perhaps in its most establishment incarnation, but there certainly at various times there was a Republican trend within it. And yes, Corbyn seconded Tony Benn's bill, didn't he, in 1991, which didn't go through. But yes, he was quite timid when he was actually in charge. We had in Redline TV, we had an interview last week. I don't know if you saw it, with Pauline Bryan, who was commissioned by Corbyn to look at constitutional changes, and they were quite timid, really, weren't they? They were quite about chamber. The House of Lords should be transformed into a chamber of. Scotland and Wales should have more of a say, but not touching the monarchy at all. She explicitly said that was not in the remit of what Corbyn wanted to look at, or the House of Lords, properly doing it away with her. So they tried to reform it in a kind of sneaky way, which I thought was a bit disappointing. Back to some of your earlier points, which I think was interesting, the two republicanisms at that time, because I think it's still going on, isn't it? We have a bourgeois republicanism, which is perhaps best represented by Republic, that campaign, and the Guardian, and maybe the Independent. It's a kind of, it makes no sense to have a monarchy. It costs so much money. It's an old throwback, etc. We can just do away with it. We'll leave everything else untouched. We don't want revolution. We don't want the working class in power. We just don't want this old relic. We want to have a modern democracy, a modern capitalism type idea. And then there's the republicanism of people like us who understand, John Rees has been speaking very well about the Levellers and how they pushed Oliver Cromwell actually to see things through with King Charles I. and actually, get rid of him in a physical way, which is a bit unpleasant. But they knew quite well if Charles I, because there were counter-revolution going on, if Charles I had come back on the throne, they would have all been executed. So they understood they have to kill him basically and chop his head off. But that was a different kind of, that they were pushed. Oliver Cromwell was pushed by the left. He was actually more representative of sort of that kind of wing of the, what we probably a liberal bourgeois or something. He was not keen on having extensive democracy. And that's something, it's very strange that much of the left still admires him as some kind of, semi-socialist leader, is a very ambivalent historical figure who, as we know, turned not just on the Levellers but the Irish, etc. So he is not somebody we should uncritically celebrate, I believe. But these two republicanisms are still going on. I think when we look at revolution in the last 100 years or 150 years, how monarchies were gotten rid of, it was tended to be part of a revolutionary movement from below. Like in Germany, the working class swept away the monarchy in its revolutionary upheavals. Russia, obviously, and I think Bulgaria as well, when you had the working class fighting for more democracy, and that's the way they got rid of the monarchy, actually, as part of a change for more and for democracy and for more social reforms, etc. So our demand, or mine anyway, or socialist, I think is very much not just abolish the monarchy and that's that. It has to be part of a campaign for real radical reforms and empowerment of the working class and changing society from top to bottom, and not just doing away with the Queen on top because she's so expensive. Hardly matters. It is the way we're being ruled. So you can reply now, or I can bring in some.
I'd like to reply now before I forget the points you made, because I've taken a few notes on, but I think that should be dealt with just now when they're fresh in my mind. So my thesis, Tina, it doesn't actually contradict what you say. Yours is a more sophisticated version of my thesis, because my thesis is this, right? Republicanism exists, then it disappears and is replaced by socialism. By socialism, I mean Labour socialism, by the way, but anyway, let's just call it for socialism. And then that's negating, it's a negation of republicanism, so republicanism disappears, and then it reappears in a synthesis of Republican socialism. However, your point is still accurate, that republicanism doesn't just disappear altogether, it carries into the Labour Party. Obviously it does. This exploding star, as I described, the little fragments go in via the Democratic Federation, via the Social Democratic Federation, as you say, Keir Hardie. There is a strand of 19th century working class republicanism carries into the Labour Party, but the point about it is that it's not the dominant strand, it's an undercurrent, it's a rebellious, something to be gotten rid of. The Labour Party is going to be a respectable governing party. Republicanism doesn't really have a role to play at all. You've just got to be in the Labour Party. If you start raising republicanism, well, what you're doing, it seems to be a waste of time. So you go right against the culture. So I'm not, so I think what you've said is true. And we as a Republican Labour have talked about the trend of republicanism within the Labour Party, but it's another work in the dialectic. Republicanism isn't liquidated; it appears within Labourism, actually. And at the end of the day, it's this republicanism which will negate the Labour Party. It hasn't done so yet. What was something else situation? Yeah. So I mean, another point you made about the timidity, as it were, of Corbyn's Republicans. Their program is timid, but the situation we're living in right now is not timid. That's the contrary. We're living in a very non-timid time. So they're timid republicanism, well, they're not even republicanism, Tina, as you outlined. Their timid stuff is dead, really. It's not going to, people aren't going to rally to something as timid as that. It's already irrelevant. So they can float around with it and career here and there, the rest of it. Okay, Okay, Cromwell, just say something about Cromwell. So I agree with you on Cromwell. Cromwell was a counter-revolutionary, but Trotsky talked about Cromwell, maybe didn't know so much about the Levellers. But what Cromwell did was he praised Cromwell not for his republicanism or his democracy, but he praised Cromwell as a revolutionary. He said the point about Cromwell was he got stuck in. He organised a whole revolutionary people's army, if you like, and then he really he didn't hesitate and hang around. He got stuck into them. Now, of course, as you've said, he turned into something else. He turned into the opposite, and he was a cautious revolutionary in all the things that you said. So, no illusions in Cromwell. But Trotsky, what Trotsky wrote about Cromwell in his writings on Britain, he contrasted Cromwell with Ramsay MacDonald. He said, what do you want to have a leader like Cromwell, or do you want to have one like Ramsay MacDonald? You know, and the answer was pretty obvious as far as Trotsky was concerned. He called him the lion of the 17th century, because that was his praise for him.
Might have been a third alternative, though.
Sorry?
It might have been a better third alternative.
Well, of course, I don't think. I mean, Trotsky, look, we're not living in our movement, but he was telling us, what he was actually telling us, which is true, is that the English left needs to get a grip on their own chart. He talked about Chartism and Cromwell, meaning that we needed to get a grip on our own history and our own culture of republicanism and democratic movements, and we could learn from Chartism a massive amount, etc. And then I think the last point about the two that I've got to make, I think, about the two Republicans, the bourgeois Republicans and the working class republicanism. But the really shock about all of this, I think, for me, is why is it that it's the bourgeois republicanism that's the most prominent of all these? Looks like they got the most supporters. They got an organization with maybe thousands of people in it. If you try to say, well, where's the working class republicanism? Well, it didn't really exist. You know, it's a few people like us or whatever. It's not an organization, not a party, whatever. So we are so far behind the game as a movement. You know, I mean, we are way behind the situation. Yeah, finish there.
Sadly, much of the left thinks it's
that's the problem. Much the left is labourist, Tina, which means they're not interested in republicanism, and they've not understood the negation that republicanism of that Labour tradition.
Yeah. Okay, I'll shut up now. Paul Collins, please.
Hello, Tina, and everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah, thanks for that, Steve. I'll have to look up some of those movements that you've mentioned. One of the things that obviously you'll probably find very repetitive because I've said it before, but I think it does need repeating. And Tina rightly made the same points in the sense that when people talk about republicanism, part of the problem is it is only looking at the royal family and not necessarily the crown. But I would argue that the crown itself is much more bigger than the family. It didn't, in terms of power, and didn't Percy Shelley say something along the lines of the monarchy is the string that ties the bow together, or something like that.
The robber's bundle, I think it was.
Yeah. So to talk about the family, it's let's get rid of the monarchy and leave the rest of it in place. Is a rather it's a bourgeois thing, isn't it, rather than a democratic thing? And I hope John Beacon doesn't mind me mentioning him in the chat, but he said in the chat that I don't understand how one can be a socialist and not be a Republican. He's spot on about that. It took me a long while to get there, but I realised what my problem was with republicanism in the early days, and that was because you had organisations like the Labour for Republic, who, when I was a member of the Labour Party, gave a speech, a presentation to my then CLP, and it talked about the family, how much it cost, but it said nothing about the crown in the way the government of the day uses the power of the crown, and it said nothing about the democratic deficit between MPs and the ministers of the crown. What I mean by that is we think that members of parliament have access to more information than we do, in many sense they do. But what I'm saying is the government of the day that decides what MPs are allowed to see. And that's the problem with the Crown and the royal prerogative. It's not even about the royal family as such. And to talk about the royal family and off with their heads and that sort of thing kind of misses the point altogether. I was going to make 2 or 3 other points, but I can't remember them now. Sorry about that. Oh, I was going to mention what happened with regards to Scotland and Wales, because from the 1997 government, they had referendums in both Scotland and Wales, didn't they? In Scotland, I think they had one about 20 or 30 years earlier. But they had referendum to have whether to have a parliament or an assembly, and of course they both gave yes votes. And with these new parliaments for Scotland and Wales, and not England, I know you haven't. I don't think you've mentioned it in this particular section. But with the fact that they've got a new parliament for Wales, well, an assembly in Wales, but they've left England alone, I think the thinking of the government at the time was that providing 2 parliaments for those 2 nations would be a way of keeping the union of the United Kingdom of Great Britain together, you know. But actually, if you combine that with the later Brexit, you can see there's a kind of schism there waiting to spontaneously combust at any moment, really, because surely as Scotland and Wales are demanding more democratic powers, so too should people in England, because it needs to be pointed out that, yes, Westminster may be based in England, but in fact, it's the UK Parliament, it's not the English Parliament. So the whole thing needs done away with and be replaced by separate parliaments in each individual nation, as well as obviously getting rid of the Crown and completely reforming the way we're governed in the countries of the current United Kingdom. Anyway, I stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, Paul. Steve, do you want to reply straight away?
I'll take Marie as well now, and then we'll see how that goes. I'm just to make sure that I forget that.
Marie next, then.
Oh, hello. A very good theme and very good explanation, Steve. I'm going to go back. I thought your French was very good, and
okay.
So I think along the things that you described, which led to the 1st of May, was it 1866?
6 of May, yeah.
They were the 1st of May, where they could not go to Hyde Park, I think you said. And
it was a 6th of May, but anyway, it doesn't matter that much. 6th of May, 1867.
Okay. And then Charles Bradlaugh had said, we will have a parliament with or without your permission. Mm-hmm. So if you could come back on that, perhaps, to show them that already there, because I understand this was a huge movement which enlisted the support of various strands of the population, that already it was understood that the parliament that they had, this is not good enough. We want a parliament, we want our parliament. So if I have just understood that correctly, this is immensely important, because it is very clear that parliament doesn't let people be represented. The working class is evoked in parliament, but there is no representation of it. And obviously everybody knows this, but what to do about it is a program which requires for us to go back to all these fights. So people were Republican, but in the anti-monarchy form that you said, if you could come back perhaps on that. The working class felt excluded from politics, but the republicanism which there was in 1869 was mainly targeted against monarchy, if I understood you well. And perhaps that could be linked, I don't know, as the process develops towards the development of empire, because throughout this period, that was a rush on Africa, if I'm not mistaken. All that period is Africa is being plundered. And so obviously this has an importance because it gives force to the ruling class. And they are bringing immense revenues to the country, and they can afford a few crumbs for the workers. So, like Tina pointed out, there was a moment when there was two strands of Republicans. So there was Republican clubs, some sort of respect for Cromwell, which I understand, and then two strands to complete, one to complete the bourgeois revolution. I wonder if that is still going on now, because still now there is a need for land reform, even in capitalist terms. How can they develop the economy if it is held just by just a handful of people who mostly probably are with the monarchy? That means they are obscurantist people who do not really represent the process of the development of capitalism. And then the others, so that was John Stuart Mill, I think you mentioned. Right, yeah. And then the other strand, which was more with the working class, La République démocratique sociale. So that was for the nationalization of the land, not just the land reform. Yes. I wonder how that fits with today, because myself the other day I was thinking, well, we need the land reform, you know, to take it out of the hand of three people. But nationalization is obviously part of a much more profound program of planning in order to produce what is necessary and to distribute and to have equality and the rest of it. The other point I wanted to make, 2 points. One about Cromwell. I think from the things I have learned in the Republican Labour group is, you know, when we studied the levelers, and then if you look at the French Revolution, there comes a moment of when the revolution is at its most advanced, and then it meets with its own limitations that are historically determined, and then inside the revolution and the revolutionaries themselves start changing because there is a process, what Trotsky described as thermidor. And that is not the fault of Cromwell, or is not the fault even, I don't mean to whitewash Stalin, but he was subject to that process as well. And around these people, a whole number and a whole layer of revolutionaries who just go back or start doubting. And because a revolution is a confrontation with a counter-revolution, all the way to the utmost of revolution, it's a fight against the counter-revolution. So you lose the best cadres, you lose the best comrades, and then come in the party people who don't have the experience, who have formed themselves in a few months, instead of the others who have died, who formed themselves over the years. And so you've got all sorts of factors which feed the counter-revolution. So counter-revolution, no, but it is a retreat of the revolution. So I think that perhaps that needs returning to explain what happens today, for example, you know, with the what used to be the Soviet Union. And then finally, just I would like to go back the other thing that was so we have confronted through history. We have realized our class has realized the enormous disposition of the ruling class to use every means to crush. If it comes to their power, they will use every of the means they have. And not only that, they create constantly new means to defend their power. I would say that today they are not, the ruling class is not defending anything but themselves, and including all their weapons and all the weapons they have put at their disposal. And so that has remained in the memory of people. And when they are building a movement, and when the Chartists saw that they could not, you could not do anything except to go to the slaughter, and you didn't have an equivalent preparation and preparedness, then that was it was better to look for other ways. What surprises me, and I would like you to return on, please, Steve, is why was it that why was it exactly that after the 1871 the process retreated, the revolutionary the republicanism retreated, and what's the role of empire in all this? And what is happening now if republicanism is incipient, what exactly, could you go back to the conclusions that you drew on what are the factors which make it now absolutely necessary that there should be a republic? And so could you explain the Democratic Federation? It started in 1880, and then it became.
I don't know the exact dates. I haven't looked it up, but yeah, go on.
Yeah,
I said 1880, but I don't know the exact date. But anyway.
All right, well, around then.
Around about then.
It became the Social Democratic Federation.
Yeah.
And republicanism wanes. If you could go back to this, that would be great, as far as I'm concerned. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Marie. We've got a question in the chat, and George also wants to speak. Do you want to address a few things first?
All right, whatever you think's best, Tina. Really, what do you think?
Why don't you say a few things that Marie brought up?
Okay. Well, I'm just trying to look at Paul. I agree generally with what Paul had to say. I don't really have anything to contradict. I'm just trying to say, did he ask me any particular questions? I agree with his, what he was kind of arguing. And I think this thesis that there's two kinds of republicanisms, bourgeois and working class, I think that's really, really essential to that. Another way, because I noticed there was something in the chat where somebody said, but yeah, we're socialists, we're all Republicans, everybody automatically, what I mean? That's why we don't need to talk about republicanism, because it's automatic that we are. Why mention it? Why ever do anything about it? But I think you've got to realize that the two kinds of Republicans are militant republicanism, people who want to fight on that basis, who've got a Republican program and want to mobilize the working class for a democratic republic, and those who are quite indifferent, soft, if you like, how should we call them, passive Republicans. And there's a heck of a lot of passive republicanism in the working class movement. They say, well, as I said before, they say, well, we're obviously Republicans, that's why we're not going to talk about it ever again, sort of thing. Well, if the Queen comes out and says something, we'll have to say something, we'll come out and say something, but apart from that, we'll say nothing. And I think that that's passive republicanism, this soft republicanism, if you like, is actually bourgeois republicanism. So there's a lot more bourgeois republicanism in the working class movement. And it's because it's bourgeois republicanism that we're adapting to the fact that the bourgeoisie doesn't really want to get rid of the constitutional monarchy. And they've come up with a plan whereby even our socialist Republicans can't be bothered with it either. It's merely a reflection of the domination of bourgeois ideas in the working class movement. Whereas the militant republicanism is the idea that we need democracy to advance the Republican, the democratic and working class cause. So I don't think that we're all Republicans, so we won't mention it type thing. I don't think that's really gonna do it. I'll have heard lots of it. I think one of the things that's quite interesting is when you look to 1867, is that in 1867, parliamentary reform was not a dead issue, and it clearly wasn't in the 19th century. But it was an issue that involved the mobilization of hundreds of thousands of people. It was a popular move. And if we had to take an equivalent today, and I know Tina's quite keen on this, we could take proportional representation as an issue where the movement is increasingly thinking we need some kind of parliamentary reform because the parliament isn't working. And we saw Unite passing a resolution, for example, other parts of the working class movement. So there is a sort of parliamentary reform agenda. And what 1867 tells us, it's not something to be done by asking Labour MPs to do something about it. That's not the way it's going to happen. What they did in 1867 was mobilize thousands and thousands of people on the streets and make a big difference in that way. And I don't think necessarily proportional representation is necessarily the answer, by the way, but it is a sign that people are conscious of the failings of our democracy, and they're all looking around and what the hell can we do about this? Maybe PR would be the answer, maybe something else, you know, and maybe a republic would be a great idea as well, or maybe an English Parliament would be another idea. So we're all trying to work out what that program is. I'm trying to look at what Marie said, because again I agree with a lot of what Marie said. I'm going to see if I've got, so I think, okay, so there's one point I've got that Marie said. I don't remember them all, but the decline of republicanism in this country, and I think I emphasize it again, it is to do, I think, with the defeat of the Paris Commune. That's the first thing that it is, because that defeat creates a whole argument in the English side of the channel. Well, did they go too far? What was wrong? Should they have not done what they did? Should, you know, and all that. So a movement that seems quite strongly in solidarity with the Paris working class starts to fall apart. So that's one thing, you know, it's become stable. But the real factor, I think, at the end of the objective factor, is at the end of the 19th century, we have the growth of this new imperialism, if you like. This, but it's almost a triumph, a revamping of the scramble for Africa and that whole new wave of imperialism, which European countries engage in, including France and Germany and everybody else who's trying to do this, to scramble to get more colonies, to get more things. And we know that Lenin's theory of imperialism just makes the working class more conservative, because it means that profits and wealth can be used to incorporate the working class, give more reforms. So we can get money from abroad, and then if we can sort of not exactly bribe the working class, but actually give them more benefits to keep them slightly more, give them more bread, you know, and circuses to go, we need bread and circuses, and that's what imperialism can give you, bread, and the Queen can give you some circuses. So I think that's what's really going on, and that's why the rise of Labourism is an adaptation to British imperialism. Labour is an imperialistic formation attached and supports the empire, supports the First World War and all those other things, because that's where it is. So I think that's it. I think there are those material factors, Marie, that leads to a kind of call it conservative, the defeat of republicanism and the rise of conservatism and the rise of imperialism. With it, the patriotism, because the working class was very proud, you know, in the 1880s, 1890s, a lot of working class people were very proud that, I don't know, a third of the world was pink. And that was us. We'd rule the whole world. It sounded pretty marvelous. And then we were told how great it was and all those other things. So you'd imagine the way that the papers and the press and all those other things got you to think that imperialism was a great thing, something to be proud of, something to be nationalistic about, and so on and so forth. I'm just looking back. Land ownership, Marie, I just go to that point. Yeah, I think you drew. I thought you weren't going to do that, but you did draw it. The difference, the bourgeois Republicans just wanted to reform land tenure, whereas Marx and the Land and Labour League, Marx is especially strong on this. He was very keen on this. One of the reasons why he thought it was important was to nationalise the land. He thought that was also linked to the Irish question, by the way. If we destroyed the English aristocracy, took the land off them, then that would spread over to Ireland. So he connected it politically to Ireland, as well as you know, and the Fenians and all those other things that were going on there. And of course, just having land nationalisation doesn't mean it's democratically controlled, but it does mean that the aristocratic classes don't have hold of the land. And if you've got a democracy to go with your land, then you can actually start to have popular control of how land is used, which I think is what we are now. It's beyond non-nationalized. Democratic control of land requires it to be publicly owned in the as a precondition almost for rational farming policy, rational food policy, rational water, environmental policies, housing policies, and all those other things is very, very important. Now, I've got this idea. I haven't really answered your questions, Marie. So if I haven't, then we can catch up again, or remind me or something, and come back again, or put it in the chat. So I hope I've done my best.
Okay, thanks, Steve. And before I bring in George, I'm just going to read out a question from Chris Jones. Disraeli not only changed the franchise to absorb working class pressure, but also initiated Tory organization within the working class to win votes. One of the themes of that organization was in support of the monarchy. Any comments on the impact on this?
I mean, okay, we'll just comment on that. I often thought that, okay, the thing that's kind of surprised me, because I didn't know much about it. I didn't know about this massive thing in 1867. It's not known in our history. 1848 is known, 1867 isn't. So you think really that the Tories gave the working class in 1867 the vote. Disraeli did it. And there's a certain aspect of truth, because it was the Tory government that did it. But Disraeli was a sharp card, and he realized that you could almost revamp Toryism and get working class people to support it by giving them the vote and then tying it up with monarchism and patriotism and imperialism and all those things. So that was the Conservative project. Take the claim, you know, it was us, the Tories, that gave us the vote. You know, never mind about those people in the park. It's that we the Tories gave these things, and then we've got the Queen and we've got everything else like that to go with it. So that's very appealing. I don't know if that really answers the question, but I think it's absolutely right.
Okay, George is next. I think his camera doesn't work, so we'll have to just hear him. Hi, George.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
Hi.
I'm going to touch on perhaps more recent historical events. The period of the 1914 to 18 war, the German monarchy was disposed of, plus the Austrian Habsburg monarchy was finally sent on its way. And also, perhaps to crown it, we had the Russian Revolution in the latter period of the First War, which possibly showed Europe the way. Particularly, it comes to mind in Germany with the struggles of the SDP. There was the uprising in Kiel in the naval base there, and there was the ascendancy of the Spartakists and Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. But I want to move on to the fact that we're living on a roller coaster of rearmament, war, and financial deprivation, not only in Britain, but also the whole of Europe. And I think there is a climate for republicanism to certainly occur in the remaining monarchies of Europe, such as Belgium, Holland, Sweden, Norway. And I think there will be a kind of repeat of the First War, perhaps the end of the First War, where you will see the working class rise, Also, I would like to remind perhaps post-45, we had something like 16 socialist republics emerge from the war. Don't forget, we owe our existence to the fact that Russia stepped into Berlin at the end of 1944. If they hadn't, I think things would be very different. But I want to move on now to the situation perhaps in Britain. And I think there is a climate for a Republican offensive and for the development of a kind of Republican Party. And also, apart from the development of an English Parliament, which is a very laudable demand, and also land reform should be a prominent demand. We should look at the situation in Ireland. I think, particularly in Northern Ireland, I think there is a room for a Republican consensus. And I don't mean a reformist type of Republican consensus, which the Sinn Féin advocates, because they are part of the capitalist consensus. We have to look at, besides an English Parliament developing a constitution for Britain, for England, we need to look at a kind of Republican Parliament which looks for a constitution, perhaps of the whole of Ireland. And I think that must come into the debate as well. I make an apology for not looking at the sort of historical perspectives prior to the First War. But I think it's relevant that we should talk about also what we're doing now, today. We're on a roller coaster, comrades, and the working class is on the march. And I think the time is right for a Republican debate. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Paul, have you got your hand up again, or is it a legacy hand?
Yes, it's coming again, but
Okay.
obviously if you don't want me to, fair enough.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I think is it okay, Steve? Bring
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Paul in now.
I was interested when you mentioned how republicanism gave way to Labourism, and I remember years ago when I was a working college student, I got a bit upset when I was looking at different forms of socialism, and my politics tutor at the time, he was right. I realise that now, but when I explained democratic socialism or what I thought we meant in Britain by socialism, I was essentially told that what I was talking about was a very British variant of socialism. as opposed to the more European standard. And of course, my politics tutor was German, and he had a much more understanding of the European elements of socialism. And that upset me at the time. I realised later on he was right, I think. And so I do think when you mentioned how the Republican movement kind of gave way to Labourism, and you mentioned Cromwell as well, and I think in another bit, but I'm not very sympathetic towards Cromwell, I must say. Apart, I understand a bit about the Model Army and the fact that they were quite well treated and so on, but when events turned, it does rather remind me of the pigs in Orwell's Animal Farm, where they just acquired the capital and used it for their own aims, as it were, and it became a counter-revolutionary. So, I don't have the same view that many comrades have of Cromwell at all in that sense. But in terms of Labourism, in the Republicans, I suppose looking back, we can kind of blame them for the fact that would you agree that in fact Labourism did kind of give way to a very British variant of socialism, if you like, which somehow combined the monarchy and the crown? Obviously, you call it secular monarchy. That makes sense to me now, but it took me a while to get there. But I think it was the fall of that movement in Britain that possibly led to that, if you agree. And I see it now when I see comrades say, perhaps we shouldn't use the term socialism, perhaps we could call it democratic socialism, making the point that if you do have genuine forms of socialism, you don't need democratic socialism because it's already democratic by default. So I don't necessarily agree with that argument. And also, some comrades say, the same comrades sometimes say that people in England, I don't know about the UK in general, but they argue that people in England are scared of socialism. And but actually, if you look at the 2017 election results, over 40% did vote for that the platform under Jeremy Corbyn, and it was only and the Tories got just over 43%. That's the closest the two parties have been for a long time at that point. So it's not true that people are scared of socialism. I just wanted to make those points. It's up to you, really. Answer them or not. Thanks anyway.
Thank you, Paul. We've got nobody else with their hands up, so you are free to sum up now, Steve.
Okay, right. There are so many. A lot of these things are contemporary politics, of course. Where I think I want to say that this period in our history is important, and there are things to be learnt from this period in history about the nature of republicanism, about its relation to socialism, about how parliamentary reform, the role that the working class played by extra parliamentary struggle in changing our constitution, even in a limited way, and the way in which our democracy is affected by, in this case, the Paris Commune, the fact that Labourism, is connected to imperialism. It's the defeat of republicanism. It's the defeat of the idea that democracy has to be fundamental to our socialism, and that somehow we can get to socialism through the constitutional monarchy. That the constitutional monarchy is the best thing that we can do, which is basically protecting the status quo. Again, have a lot of agreement with what Comrade said. I would just say I probably would say one point to George. I think we should not, I've tried to emphasize the point that we shouldn't think that republicanism is only relevant in countries that have got a monarchy. Because even though you've got a republic, you can have another republic and a better republic than the one you've got. And I think that's what Mélenchon is doing. He's raising a republican argument in France. Whether he'll follow through on it, I don't know. But the process that he is talking about of having a constituent assembly and a new constitution, that opens the whole questions of political power. And one might argue that in America, there could be a Republican movement now against the Trumpian movement, which is in which American democracy is being destroyed. So I don't think we should simply totally think that republicanism is only relevant to countries that have a monarchy. I don't think we disagree on Cromwell. I'm sure that we don't. I think the only point I was making was that Cromwell was a counter-revolutionary, but he was also, and he was a bourgeois revolutionary, you know. But the point was, he did lead a revolutionary movement, and we recognise that that is something historically of great importance and significance. And in explaining to people that revolution can change things for the better, even if it didn't end up quite like that. Yes, I suppose Labourism is the British version of socialism in a way, or gives us a British version of socialism. And it's a socialism without democracy, or socialism where democracy is not that important, or that democracy is really a constitutional monarchy. And therefore, in that sense, Labourism is a kind of conservative type of socialism. And our task is to make sure the Labour Party considers this point, which they never had, and try to get the working class and trade union movement to see the importance. The case for Republican socialism is really a case that democracy has to be a very, very important starting point for all our struggles and can bring all those struggles together. So I would urge comrades to look at this period. I think Kevin's going to carry on with it next week. He's going to be looking at Irish republicanism and the role of the Fenians, and maybe that'll connect to what George is saying, the importance of Northern Ireland at the present moment in time, because the Good Friday Agreement is now in a mess because of Brexit. And it looks likely that the Good Friday Agreement is, which Sinn Féin holds to, actually is a barrier to republicanism, you know, at the end of the day. So I think there will be a new move to unite Ireland. It has to come out of that, and the need for a constituent assembly. The slogan of a constituent assembly, a special kind of parliament. And maybe I'll end on this, not ramble on too much longer, but I'll end on this point. Discovering the idea that in the 19th century, both in the Chartist movement and in the 1867 movement, that people were prepared to think of an alternative parliament, that the people could organize their own parliament if the parliament that they had didn't work. And the one place that a parliament isn't working, I'd say, is Westminster. It's getting more farcical by the day. It's a just complete shambles of a place now. So I think that the working class movement's got to think about what Unite was doing with PR, think about what the movement needs, and we need to take it in a different direction. John Beeching, I think, made a comment. But I just acknowledge that. I saw it in the chat. And he seemed to say the point that, you know, he seemed to make the point, or I interpret it to mean that all those people say, well, of course, we're all socialists, we're all Republicans, let's forget about it. Obviously, John clarified that that's not what he meant. And I was answering that because there is that trend that says we don't need to do anything on republicanism because we are by definition. John, I think, answers, he says, certainly, I didn't mean it doesn't need saying. It's more that socialism is impossible without republicanism. It's not just it's impossible without it. I would go further than that and say it is the road to get there. If it's the road to get there, is ignoring it is not getting you on the right road. I mean, you mess around for as long as you like, but if you don't take the road that can get us towards the point where we can start to socialize the economy, take over the ownership of the economy. We need democracy to do that. We need a republic to be able to do that. And that, I think, is what Marx was telling us about. And I think that's what Lenin was telling us about. And I think the whole history of our movement tells us that that is really, really important. And I hope that we'll carry on with this next week. There we are, Tina.
Thank you, Steve. Well, it's certainly important that the left reclaims Republican socialism or socialist republicanism, however way you want to hear it. And it's a shame that much of the left see as some kind of diversion, whereas, as Steve says, I think it's very, very integral for the fight for socialism. Okay, next week, as Steve said, we'll be joined by Kevin Bean, who's going to be a good introduction. And we're actually coming to the end of that series, and then we are launching a new series called The Lives of the Left. So where we want to look at historic figures, current figures, perhaps even, we haven't decided if they have to be dead or alive, but they could probably be alive as well. So left biographies, left interesting personalities that have probably been not looked at in the way they deserve. So if you have a particular expertise, anybody in the audience, or knows anybody who has a particular expertise on anybody in particular from the left socialist history, get in touch with us, info@labourleft.org, and we can discuss you presenting a session or half a session, etc. So hope to see you all next Thursday. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.